Hello and thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Nick Blumberg. Brandis Friedman has the evening off. Here's what we're looking at. Mayor Johnson's veto of a snap curfew ordinance faces a test from city council members. A live report from City Hall. What can be done to avoid an international nuclear war? A group of Nobel laureates gather in Chicago to discuss. Unemployment is on the rise for black women. We unpack the reasons behind it and what it could mean for the labor market. And the story behind some of Chicago's most iconic foods in tonight's edition of WTTW News Explains. First off tonight, the first mayoral veto in 19 years will stand. The Chicago City Council tried and failed today to override Mayor Brandon Johnson's veto of the so-called snap curfew proposal, falling 6 votes short. That outcome was never in doubt, allowing Mayor Johnson to declare victory even before the votes were counted. Let's take a listen.
The easy thing to do would be to play into the political theater of safety. The easy thing to do would be to tell people that if we threaten young people and families with severe repercussions, that somehow would make us safer. But we know from years of doing the same old tired forms of policy that it doesn't get the results that people have longed for. It doesn't keep us safe, and it doesn't make our city stronger.
Our Heather Sharon joins us now with more. Heather, the unsuccessful vote to override that mayor's veto came without any debate. Why was that?
Well, we have been talking about this issue and this proposal in specific for months. And essentially, everybody on the city council had already made up their mind about it long ago. So this attempted override was essentially a formality. But it came in a very specific context. Crime in Chicago is down nearly 30%, both homicides and shooting. That has allowed Mayor Johnson to say that his approach to public safety in Chicago is working, and it has blunted criticism from his opponents who say measures like this, which are designed to crack down on young people, perhaps skirting the law, is necessary.
So the mayor seems pretty confident that this is a political winner for him. Is it?
Well, it certainly is among progressive organizations who have certainly had their ups and downs with this mayor over his first more than 2 years in office. They demanded this veto and they got it, and it perhaps will allow Mayor Johnson to reset a little bit and start directly addressing what the needs and the wants of the groups who elected him in the first place want to see for the remainder of what he hopes will be his first term in office.
Yeah, hard to get reelected without keeping those folks happy. Now, there was some drama today surrounding a plan to allow Chicagoans to build coach houses and granny flats across the city, another issue we've been discussing. Why didn't that measure get a vote today?
Well, as we talked about last night, Nick, this would really weaken aldermanic prerogative, the ability of each alderperson to determine what gets built in their wards. And there was a last-minute flurry of negotiations off the city council floor to try to reach an agreement that would have allowed a vote today. That was unsuccessful. And Alderman Marty Quinn of the 13th Ward, who has declared that this proposal is an attack on the bungalow belt and Chicago's working class, joined forces with Alderman Greg Mitchell of the 7th Ward to prevent a vote today. That means it will have to wait until the City Council comes back in September to reconsider this measure. And what specifically this proposal looks like after another month or two of negotiations, I think is really anybody's guess at this point.
A lot can happen over that summer break. Okay, before we let you go, the City Council also moved to tighten the city's ethics ordinance. One alderperson voted no. Who was that?
That was Alderman Jim Gardner of the 45th Ward on the far northwest side. That was, I think, specifically important for him because he has found himself in the crosshairs of Inspector General Deborah Witzberg, who declared years ago that he violated the ethics ordinance by, she said, targeting a frequent critic of his in his ward. He gave a long speech today saying that he wasn't against ethics reform, but had concerned that all city departments and all city officials weren't being treated equally. It was clear that there was a lot going on behind the scenes, and we will have to see what happens between the two of them. Inspector General Deborah Witzberg has not commented on the outcome of her probe into Alderman Gardner, which was ultimately dismissed by an administrative law judge.
There's always a lot going on behind the scenes at the council, and you keep us informed. Heather Sharon, thanks very much. And you can read Heather's full story on our website. That's at WTTW.com/news. Up next, on the 80th anniversary of the world's first nuclear detonation, a look at where nuclear warfare stands today. The Trinity test 80 years ago today ushered in a new nuclear era. After its devastating use in World War II, a nuclear weapon hasn't been deployed since, but amid growing global tensions, major gaps in diplomatic relations, and fitful efforts to reduce the weapon stockpile, some experts are warning it's time for world leaders to renew their focus on preventing nuclear war. A group of Nobel laureates and experts gathered at the University of Chicago today for an assembly focused on just that existential issue. Joining us now with more via Zoom are Manpreet Sethi, a distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi, where she heads its nuclear issues program, and Ankit Panda, a senior fellow with the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you both very much for joining us. Ankit Panda, I'd like to start with you, please. What's happening in the world right now? What are some of the factors that made an event like today's gathering so necessary in your eyes?
Well, thanks. So the way I would put it is that the moment the Cold War ended, the world broadly entered a more optimistic period when it came to nuclear weapons. And today, all of those trend lines are heading in the wrong direction. We have a far more acrimonious set of relationships among the major great powers. We have quickly changing new technologies. We have an America that is playing a very different role than it used to in the international system. And all of this together with a lot more behind the scenes is leading to a world where nuclear weapons are back at the center and nuclear risks need to be taken seriously by everybody once again.
Yeah, you just discussed some of the important factors. Is there a single biggest or perhaps a couple biggest threats that you think could create another Cold War-like situation?
Well, in terms of a Cold War-like situation, I would point to the very difficult relationships today that the United States has with both Russia and China, both countries with nuclear weapons. China is growing the size of its nuclear weapons. It is the fastest growing nuclear country on Earth today. As we've seen tragically since 2022, the use of force to change borders has also become worryingly more normalized. And so the risk is that we could see a conventional war break out between these countries where nuclear weapons would linger in the background and hopefully never come into the foreground. But that, of course, can't be taken for granted.
Manpreet Sethi, he just mentioned some of the potential, sites of conflict. Are there particular nuclear risks posed by flashpoints like, say, Ukraine, Iran, the India-Pakistan border? What are you looking at in those particular areas?
In fact, all of the three theaters that you mentioned, Nick, have the nuclear shadow on them. So when we saw the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it was with the brinksmanship being exercised by Russia. In the Israel-Iran, we did see the nuclear facilities of Iran being targeted by a country that is supposed to have nuclear weapons, along with the US, which does have nuclear weapons. And in the India-Pakistan case as well, these were two countries, nuclear-armed neighbors that were getting into a conflict situation. So certainly the nuclear shadow in all of these theaters which are in conflict right now has been felt.
Well, you just outlined some of the, the risks that we're facing. Ankit Panda, this is perhaps more imminent than it's been in previous decades. What would you hope to see world leaders do to avoid nuclear conflict?
So the first thing to do is to recognize that we are in a moment of heightened nuclear risk. I don't think world leaders can take for granted that the world we built in the 1990s after the Cold War ended, that better world where we legitimately did do a lot of things to stabilize and move the trend lines in the right direction, that is not the world we're in now. So the first step is, I think, raising that awareness among leaders. The second step is going to be to recall the lessons of the first and second nuclear ages, the period of essentially the last 80 years. the lessons that, of course, Oppenheimer and co. didn't necessarily have during the Trinity test, but that we discovered by ourselves here in the United States with the Soviet Union, and of course in other parts of the world as the Cold War went on and in the aftermath of the Cold War. These include arms control, risk reduction, confidence building, transparency, all of the things that we as a human species built to ensure that our coexistence with the bomb would be more manageable, if not entirely risk-free.
You know, one of the hopeful signs that many folks saw, were things like non-proliferation treaties. Manpreet Sethi, is there enough international coordination to perhaps reinvigorate some of those talks for those treaties?
Unfortunately, we seem to be in a time where not only the nuclear weapon states which are not talking to each other, but there is also a growing friction between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states, which was evident in the preparatory committee meeting this year of the NPT, and going ahead in 2026 to the NPT review conference, unless some of the underlying issues gain a positive trend line, we are going to see a very difficult NPT review conference in 2026. I would also like to suggest that while people like us who work in the nuclear field, for us every year is important, but marking some of the important landmark years like what we are doing this year, the 80th year of the Trinity test and also the 80th year of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, allows us to reach out to the larger public, which can then galvanize into action and put some pressure on leaders, because we don't see the leadership by itself being interested in these issues at this moment in time, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, how about that idea? There was so much focus during the Cold War on the risk of, perhaps a nuclear strike. How has, the landscape changed? Perhaps how much has the public's attention on these issues changed?
The attention has come down significantly. In fact, from the time when people used to constantly fear the possibility of use of nuclear weapons, we've gone past that stage. And today you are in a situation where there isn't sufficient attention to an issue like this. So therefore, for the Nobel laureates and the expert community to come together, along with the academics and the activists, who normally work in silos by themselves. So I think what was unique about this laureate assembly was to bring different constituencies together to interact with each other, learn lessons from each other, and try to give hope. While we are all fearful about the nuclear risks, I think it's also about looking at some of the positive stories that came out of successes in the past and how can we implement them again going into the future.
We've got about 30 seconds left, but of course there's also the issue of nuclear power. Ankit Panda, President Trump signed orders back in May trying to quadruple production of nuclear power in the next 25 years. Is that a realistic timeline?
So the world is more interested in nuclear power because we're facing a climate crisis. That might not be what's driving President Trump, but that's a global fact. What's happening in the US gives me one big concern, which is when it comes to non-proliferation. President Trump's orders, I think, are moving the direction of reversing a longstanding US policy of not promoting the spread of reprocessing technology. I won't go into what that is, but the basic point is that that makes the spread of nuclear weapons fundamentally a lot likelier. And so there is a need to also pay attention to the fact that while we seek to rely more on nuclear energy, we do so in ways that are responsible and don't lead to new risks of nuclear proliferation.
Yeah, certainly as critical in this moment as it's ever been. We thank you both for sharing your expertise. That's all the time we have. Manpreet Sethi and Ankit Panda, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, what's behind rising unemployment for Black women? The number of Black women facing unemployment is on the rise. While the national average unemployment rate stands at 4.1%, Black women hover nearly 2 percentage points higher and nearly 3 percentage points higher than white women. Here with more on why are Brian Thompson, clinical professor of economics at DePaul University, and via Zoom, Kristen Brody, senior economist, advisor, and director of the Economic Mobility Project at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Thank you both for joining us. Kristen Brody, I'd like to start with you, please. The unemployment rate for Black women in March was 5.1%. It was 6.1 in April, 6.2 in May, slightly down in June, 5.8%. Why are we seeing that kind of fluctuation?
We did see an increase in age, and overall for Black people, we did see an increase in their unemployment rate. But we have to look at the healthcare sector between May and June. And so if we look at healthcare and social services, we saw an increase of around 58,000 jobs. And if we just look at healthcare, we see an increase of around 39,000 jobs. And we know that this is one area that Black women are overrepresented.
Well, how about that, Professor Thompson? Do we know why Black women are overrepresented in certain sectors like healthcare, things like government jobs as well? What are some of the factors behind that?
Sure. I mean, I think with this data, it's hard to draw big conclusions just because it's a small amount of data and it's a thin margin. But I do think that in terms of, you start thinking about government-related jobs, they tend to be safe jobs. And so if people feel safe in those positions and they expect to be able to have those positions over long periods of time, they seem like good positions to acquire. And so I think that could be a role in this case. Even
though there may be some uncertainty in how many jobs are available.
Correct.
Well, you know, just looking at this more broadly, what sorts of concerns does it raise for you to see a particular demographic group like this experiencing such a significantly higher unemployment rate?
Sure. I mean, I think that it can be discouraging. It can be discouraging for younger students that are graduating. It can be discouraging for individuals that find themselves recently unemployed. And so, you know, as I mentioned, it's hard to draw conclusions, and we don't want to draw conclusions. But the reality of it is that that sentiment plays a role. And so, I could see a situation where it seems unsettling for the demographic.
Kristen Brody, you know, 2020, obviously the job market took an incredible hit that year, but how do the numbers that we're seeing for the unemployment rate for Black women compare to 2020?
When we think about the pandemic beginning, the unemployment rate went from around 4.4% to 14.8%. And the unemployment rate for Black women and Hispanic or Latino women was much higher. And so these numbers are a lot better, but as you said in the beginning, historically, the unemployment rate for Black women has been around 2.2 percentage points higher than the overall rate. So yes, the numbers have come down, but they could come down even further.
You know, the Federal Reserve System, Kristen Brody, they released data from 2019 to 2022 showing median wealth for white households is $285,000, $62,000 for Latinos, and $44,890 for Black households. How much does the unemployment rate factor into the racial wealth gap, or is that just one of the factors we should be considering?
So that is one of the very many factors that contributes to the racial wealth gap. And I know that we could say that the racial wealth gap is decreasing. So the survey of finances is released every 3 years. So in 2019, average white household had median wealth of 9.9 times that of Black households. Then it came down to 7.8 and then 6.3 times. But the number, the dollar amount has actually increased. So that dollar gap has gone from 153,000 in 2016, then 165,000 in 2019. But with the latest report in 2022, 240,000.
Professor Thompson, when it comes to the racial wealth gap, how important is it for people to understand sort of stable, long-term focused approaches to trying to close that gap?
Sure. I mean, I think this is where there's a great area of opportunity. You know, the behavioral economics story behind this would be that in situations where we lack information, we have fear. And so when individuals don't pursue opportunities for investment and they don't pursue opportunities for long-term growth of income, it's because of a lack of information in many cases. And so I think there's a great opportunity for educating people about the various opportunities for growing their wealth and being aware of things like inflation and things that can be adverse to your wealth creation.
Well, you know, and speaking of education, particularly higher education, there are a growing number of black women in the United States earning higher education degrees. Kristen Brody, is that translating necessarily to higher wages?
To take out student loans to go to college, and they're more likely to owe more because, well, partially because their wages are less. So yes, education is a good thing, but we have to look at how much it costs, how much of people's income they're having to spend on it, and for people who do take out loans, how they're going to pay those loans back.
We've got about a minute left. Professor Thompson, for recent grads, you know, a lot of folks have been saying they're struggling to find a job right now. How would you advise people, you know, especially black women who we've been focusing on, to navigate that, given that there are a lot of factors that may be outside of their control?
And that's the key. There's many factors outside of your control, and I would say that you have to focus on what you can control. And I think the first step is to know what you want. You know, by defining what you want, it's more likely you are to get it. And then in the space of trying to, you know, seek employment, it's about understanding the value that you can bring to the job market. That's really the key. You're not your major, you are the person that can deliver value to the job market.
All right, well, there is much more to talk about here, but I'm afraid that's where we'll have to leave it tonight. Kristen Brody, Professor Brian Thompson, thank you both for joining us. We appreciate it. And we're back with more right after this.
Chicago Tonight, Black Voices, is made possible in part by the support of these donors.
Chicagoans are celebrating National Hot Dog Day today, because of course we are. The iconic Chicago dog is just one of many tasty treats the city is known for. In tonight's edition of WTTW News Explains, we take a bite out of these beloved classics and the history behind them. Here's Amanda Vinicky.
Chicago is home to a plate full of iconic foods. The Italian beef sandwich was born here in the early 20th century. Gyros were introduced to America in Chicago during the mid-60s. As for dessert, the brownies said to have been invented at the Palmer House Hotel in 1893. But more than anything else, Chicago is known for its hot dogs and its pizza. In the late 18 and early 1900s, Chicago was butcher to the world. The stockyards were humming along. Needless to say, meat scraps were plentiful, as were Frankfurt-loving German immigrants in need of cheap eats. Enter the Chicago-style hot dog. Of course, this isn't just any dog. A true Chicago dog must be all beef, nestled in a steamed poppy seed bun, and dragged through the garden. Chicago's 7 standard toppings come from around the world and represent our immigrant roots. The poppy seed bun is here via Poland. The hot dog itself, the pickle spear, and mustard have Jewish and German roots. Diced white onions and sliced tomatoes, that's Italy and maybe Greece. The relish hails from England, although the unnatural neon color is all ours. Sports peppers rep the deep south and/or Mexico. And as one of the country's biggest celery producers at the time, Chicago's Lakeview community contributed the sprinkling of celery salt. Lore has it, vendors added so many toppings to the dog so it could serve as a meal on a bun for broke Chicagoans during the Depression. Still hungry? Feast on another Chicago staple, pizza! Chicago's famous for its deep dish pies, inches of pan-baked crust and oozing cheese covered in tangy tomato sauce and toppings, a creation largely credited to what is now Chicago's Pizzeria Uno in 1943. But locals know the real deal is thin crust. Really thin. Also known as tavern style because it originated as a go-to treat in Chicago bars. After Prohibition was lifted, taverns encouraged customers to stay a while and drink more beer by offering snack-sized squares of cracker-thin pizza, often for free. The thin crust kept the pizza fast and cheap to make. The squares could be easily served on napkins, and the small slices wouldn't spoil supper. Unlike our hot dog, there aren't many rules around tavern-style pizza. Get it as thin as possible, slice it in squares, and top it with anything you like. I recommend giardiniera, though Chicago pizza makers say sausage is the most popular. If you're still hungry, we can dish on other local delicacies, courtesy of Chicago innovation, like the pizza puff, the burrito, the Maxwell Street Polish, salonaki.
If that didn't leave you hungry, I don't know what will. And by the way, tavern style or bust. You can find more from our WTTW News Explained series on our website. That's WTTW.com/explains. And that's our show for this Wednesday night. If you're looking for more context on the complicated issues that matter most to you, sign up for our free email newsletter, The Daily Chicagoan. You can do that by visiting WTTW.com/newsletter. Join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Nick Blumberg. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that serves the needs of clients in the Chicago area and throughout the nation.